local faces here, so it's nice to see a few familiar faces, but thank you very much. I'll just get my slideshow up and running, which I hope you can all see. As Arthur said, I spent my lockdown, the first one, from March to the autumn, examining the wartime ban on ringing between 1940 and 1943. I've always been interested in the ban, and then in March there were those passing references to this being the first time since the war that the ringing of bells have been, etc., 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 which spurred me on to find out more. I thought innocently when I started this project that it would be a relatively modest task, but the more I researched and discovered, the more I realized how wrong I was. The initial main sources were back copies of the Ringing World and Hansard, the parliamentary record, both of which I could access from online at home. But I also eventually needed to see some official government, military and church papers if I wanted to put together a fuller story. Luckily, I was able to arrange in September 2020 a trip to London to spend a day at the National Archives in Kew before the second lockdown started. And this talk is based on the ensuing 4 articles that Arthur mentioned, which were published in the Ringing World in December and January.
Bob,
it takes as its model.
I'm sorry, but we can't see the slideshow.
Oh, yeah, I've got it on my screen.
In rehearsals, it all went swimmingly, but sorry.
Shall I try again?
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt you.
No, you can't see it. I'll try again. Shall I got share screen?
Yeah.
Share.
That's it.
You see it now?
Yeah, and if you place it on screen slideshow, that's it. Perfect. Thank you.
That's all right. No, I wouldn't want to go right to the end and then you tell me. Lovely. Now, where was I? Yes. Oh, right. Yeah. So it takes as its model a program on BBC Radio 4, which you may have heard of, called The Long View. In it, a contemporary event or phenomenon is taken and compared to historical events, which appear to have some similarities. Starting as this program does, therefore, the ringing of church bells is stopped, towers fall silent, eventually limited ringing returns for Sundays only, but there is no practice or peal ringing. The Ringing World has editorials and prints letters on the subject as ringers express frustration and some anger at this infringement on their activity. There is some confusion and lack of clarity over how the rules should be applied. There is concern that the continuation of the ban will damage the long-term future of ringing. This is the case in 2020, 2021, but it was also the situation between June 1940 and June 1943. Now, the wartime ban was announced on the wireless, as it was called in those days, on the 13th of June 1940, just over a week after the evacuation of Allied forces from Dunkirk was completed, and given legal force by the Control of Noise Defence Order 1940, made on the 19th of June 1940. The first paragraph of that order read, quote, "No person shall, in any area in Great Britain, sound any church bell or cause or permit any church bell to be sounded, except for the purpose of making a signal in accordance with directions given by a commissioned officer of His Majesty's forces or the chief officer of police for the area, to indicate that members of an enemy force are landing or attempting to land or have landed from the air." Close quotes. In May 1943, Lord Geddes gave this account of the origin of the order. Lord Ironside, who was then Chief of the Imperial General Staff, was in my room. I think it was he who said, "How are you going to get these local defence volunteers together if parachutists suddenly appear?" And somebody in the room, not I, said, "Why, we will ring the church bells until we can think of something better." First reaction to the ban came in a front page editorial in the Ringing World on the 21st of June 1940, entitled Effective Ban on Church Bells. The editor and proprietor at that time was J.S., better known as Jack Goldsmith. He said, "The order has been made, and until the ban is lifted, it has got to be observed, but it will have incalculable effects upon the exercise and upon the art." It was reported in the ringing world on the 12th of July 1940 that, quote, "In the House of Lords, Lord Montestone, who was a former Secretary of State for War, made an eloquent appeal for the raising of the ban now placed on the ringing of church bells. He said, 'What folly was this to tell our people not to ring the bells because bell ringing must be kept for some particular occasion? Who was the timid soul who suggested that?'" By the end of that month, the letters to the ringing world had started, raising doubts, questions, and concerns. Quote, "Has the ringing exercise been hoodwinked into a state of complacent acceptance of an order which is unworkable with any degree of efficiency?" The ringing world editorial on the 2nd of August 1940 said, "Apart from the doubtful effectiveness of the alarm, it is indeed remarkable that proper instructions have not been issued as to the action to be taken by the public when they hear a bell denoting the arrival of parachutists. And still more strange is that hundreds, if not thousands, of parishes are without any information of the official arrangements for the ringing of the alarm bell. It is proof, we think, that the decision which led to the order was never very well considered." And this was just the start of the discontent. A week later, on the 9th of August 1940, which of course was at the height of the Battle of Britain, the ringing world editorial headline was "Uncertainty Still Prevails," and raised the level of rhetoric. It said, "More and more the clergy as well as ringers are becoming perturbed at the silence of the bells without any adequate arrangements having been made for their use for the purpose for which they are now reserved." During the remainder of August 1940, new angles emerged, like the use of sacred bells for any secular or wartime use. Service ringing, distinct from an invasion signal or warning, ringing morale, and the safety of bells in inexperienced hands. As you would expect, the letters pages were not quiet on the subject either. Quote, "I suggest that it would be possible for you to organise a mass petition from ringers in general against what is generally accepted to be a very impractical ban on ringing. Whilst a few letters urge caution. Quote, on the whole, it seems better that so long as any restriction whatever is placed upon the use of bells, the silence should be complete. And finally, is this the time when the authorities should be troubled with what is after all a very trivial matter?" In the Daily Mail, there is the religious side of the question. "We are told we are fighting against a system that set out to kill religion. For that fight, we need a prayerful nation, a people ever listening for those calls which draw them together. What are those calls? Why the church bells?" Now, a series of communications in the War Office files from September and October 1940 indicate that there was also no little confusion inside the military. A letter from Southern Command to GHQ Home Forces, quote, "I most strongly urge that the system of ringing church bells to give general warning of parachute attack be discontinued at once," which brought the following response. "There appears to be some misapprehension about what the orders are concerning the ringing of church bells. It is therefore clear that the ringing of church bells is in no sense a general warning, and orders are explicit that in no circumstances will church bells be rung merely because they have been heard ringing elsewhere." A letter from Eastern Command seemed to have completely misunderstood the ban while simultaneously putting up arguments in favour of it. "In some cases, arrangements have been made locally to call out the Home Guard by bugle. Elsewhere, some other means is required since the ringing of church bells is now not allowed. An alternative which I recommend would be the use of hand-operated foghorns. I do not know why it was decided to prohibit the use of church bells for calling out the Home Guard. They provide a means which is available everywhere. Now, by November 1940, the immediate danger of invasion seemed to have passed, at least until the spring. In the House of Commons, Sir J. Jarvis asked the Home Secretary whether he would now permit the church bells of England to ring again. In answer, Mr. McBain, "No, sir. I am advised by the military authorities that the grounds on which the original order was made still hold good." The editor of the Ringing World was predictably unimpressed. Ringers and many others will be deeply disappointed with the answer. And then a letter in that edition moved the argument in a new direction. Quote, "By making the church bells of England a signal for invasion, every church tower in the country has been made a military object of the first water, and the enemy is quite justified in bombing every one of them to pieces." Inevitably, as 1940 drew to a close, the calls grew for the bells to be returned to the church for their true purpose, especially at Christmas. Readers of The Times, no less, gave voice. "Now that the dangers of invasion seem to have materially reduced, I venture to suggest to the authorities that there are many people in England who would once again like to hear the sound of our church bells, calling us to remember and to worship God." The editor of the Ringing World mourned rather dramatically, "Everyone will regret, and many people very deeply, that no church bells will be heard in our land this Christmastide, the first time for 1,000 years." At the same time, there was a fascinating exchange about the possibility of ringing for Christmas 1940, something that eventually did not happen, but it gives an early indication of some of the extreme caution in government. The Prime Minister wrote, "I have authorised the ringing of church bells on Christmas Day. Perhaps, however, you will let me know what alternative methods of giving the alarm you would propose to use on that day, and secondly, what steps will be taken to ensure that the ringing of the bells for church services and without any invasion do not in fact lead to an alarm. There must certainly be no relaxation of vigilance." However, before December 1940 was out, this fascinating argument and debate was to branch out in even more directions. First, believe it or not, the Central Council was lambasted. Quote, "What is needed is that someone, and it ought to be the Central Council, should tell the powers that be how ineffectual the bells will prove if they are relied upon." With British military success against the Italians in the Western Desert in early December 1940, the editor of the Ringing World had yet another stick to beat that order. He said, "It is one of the tragedies of the ban on church bells that they cannot now be used to signalise the victory of our arms. In the meantime, the church's great festivals, the country's great military victories, are presumably to pass unmarked." Now, the new year of 1941 saw reports of an earlier intervention by Cosmo Lang, the Archbishop of Canterbury, before Christmas. He had written, the government record shows that the Archbishop of Canterbury has made strong representations to the government, urging that the time has now come when the existing order might be modified so as to permit the ringing of the bells on Christmas Day and thereafter on Sundays only. The Secretary of State for War received these representations with full understanding and sympathy, but he has now informed the Archbishop that the highest military authorities are unable to advise that any change in the existing order should be made. In February 1941, attention briefly returned again to the House of Commons, but this exchange on the 11th of February 1941 did little to help. Mr. Wedgwood asked the Prime Minister what exactly is to be the alarm signal for invasion. The Prime Minister's response, "At the proper moment, that information will be imparted." Finally, 8 months after the order came into force, some official clarification was at last forthcoming. The Ringing World of the 21st of February 1941 reported, "A leaflet will be distributed to the general public during the next few days. The people are given full and detailed instructions of what they are to do, and they are told that there will be no attempt to rouse the nation by ringing bells in the way that the country was called to arms by fire beacons when the Armada came in 1588. If church bells are rung at all, it will be as a warning to the local troops that the enemy have been seen landing by air near the church in question. It will not concern anyone else, and if members of the general public hear any bells, it is their duty to take no notice. However, official papers from March to May 1941 seem to indicate a continued need for reassurance. In a memorandum from GHQ Home Forces to all commands dated the 7th of March 1941, entitled Ringing of Church Bells, it said, quote, "The Commander-in-Chief directs that army commanders will satisfy themselves that the following points are fully understood by those concerned. A, that the ringing of church bells signifies the landing of parachutists in the neighbourhood of the church in question. B, who is to give the order to ring the bells. C, that the bells in question are capable of being rung. D, that a person capable of ringing them. E, that access to the belfry is in order. The necessary arrangements should be made in conjunction with the incumbent of the parish concerned." As 1941 progressed, the frenzy J.A., better known as Jimmy Trollope, sounded a note of acceptance and resignation in the first anniversary editorial, a year of the ban, alongside a rallying call that strikes a note of relevance today. He said, "No representations, however, even from the highest quarters, have succeeded in getting the ban eased by one iota, and it can only be concluded that the government still believe that the sounding of church bells will be the most effective call to arms in the case of airborne invasion." What of ringing under the ban? It has received a tragic setback. Associations, most of them, have made heroic efforts to keep their organisation intact, but most of them have suffered badly. Splendid work has been put in by many officials in their endeavours to keep the members together by organising periodical meetings. By Zoom, modern day assertion. By the summer of 1941, the war may have hotted up with the German invasion of the Soviet Union, but to the English ringer, anger and resentment at the ringing ban seem to have made way to our native sense of mockery and humour. Who will ring the bells? Let us realise how these things will not be done. The ringers will not be change ringers. B, the method will not be double court Granser triples or Norwich caters. C, the striking will be no means what it should. On the contrary, A, the ringers will be German parachutists. B, the method will be Hitler's surprise. C, the ringing and striking will be most unorthodox. In support of theory A, the Germans have accompanied their occupation of various countries with the ringing of church bells. In support of theory B, the Germans will not have had the time or the amenities to learn the standard methods. In support of C, the Germans have done nothing orthodox in this war yet. In light of the above, let us reread the government's injunction as set out in your leader, and we shall see that the ringing of any bells when the invasion begins will show us exactly where the Germans are. The Home Secretary, Herbert Morrison, had written in August 1941 to another MP, quote, "Admittedly, churches in urban areas have suffered seriously from enemy action, but it has been in the course of an indiscriminate attack and does not indicate that they have become military objectives because their bells might be used for giving a signal." This was the issue that was to run in the closing months of 1941. To my mind, apart from the romantic vision of who owns church property, the following correspondence in an age before precision bombing got it right. The government have not confiscated or even commandeered the bells. They have reserved the use of them to act as warnings in case of invasion. In a sense, they, the bells, do not belong to the local church authorities, except as trustees. They certainly do not belong to us as ringers. They belong to England, and if England has need of them in her hour of danger, she has every right to use them. The government order has not increased in the slightest the risk of bells being damaged. We may be perfectly sure that not one German bomb has ever been dropped with the actual intention of damaging a church tower and its bells, because they are military objectives. As the ringing community moved through the second autumn of the ban, the editor of the Ringing World seemed to accept its continuance. He wrote in September 1941, again with some modern echoes, "Until the danger of invasion is past, there will be no church bell ringing. We still do not see a real need for the restrictions, but while this silence is ordained, it is useless to kick against it, and ringers must make the best of a bad job." Back in the House of Commons on the 9th of December 1941, with unfortunate timing just 2 days after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Rear Admiral Beamish asked the Prime Minister whether he is satisfied that the high standard rapidly being attained by the Home Guard and the general preparedness in the country now justifies the restoration of church bells to their normal function, and will he consider Christmas Day as a suitable occasion for such a change? Prime Minister, of course, was on his way to Washington to speak to Mr. Roosevelt. So in his stead, Mr. Attlee, the Lord Privy Seal, answered, "I would refer my right honourable and gallant friend to the reply which my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, gave last year. The position is still the same as stated in that reply, i.e. no." The first half of 1942 was the quietest on the issue since the ban's imposition. In the columns of the Ringing World, one reader displayed a rare example of the what I would call get a grip school of thought. "My personal opinion has always been that once the ban was put on, it would not be lifted so long as the Germans hold the coastline of the continent." In his editorial on the 26th of June 1942, the editor, after waxing lyrical about England being a ringing isle, summed up, "We accept the situation, not willingly, still less gladly, but without complaining. We do not question the right or the competence of the persons who decided that the bells should be used as a warning, though we may doubt whether they would actually be very effective for that purpose. We must face the fact that not until victory and peace come will there be any likelihood of the ban being lifted." However, in a year's time, the war would be far from over, but all restrictions on ringing would be removed. In that last year of ringing restrictions, Parliament was increasingly to take centre stage. In the House of Lords in October 1942, Lord Montestone spoke again. He said, "Above all, let us get rid of the fantastic folly of warning the soldiers and the people of invasion by means of church bells. How foolish is that?" In his Ringing World editorial of the 6th of November 1942, the editor repeated his earlier prediction that, quote, "However much we may regret the imposition of the ban, we should do well to reconcile ourselves to the silence of our bells until the day of victory." He undoubtedly was referring to final victory. Little did he know that a victory, sooner than that, at Alamein, was to raise hopes of a more immediate lifting of the ban. On the 3rd of November 1942, the Battle of El Alamein ended with the Axis forces in retreat, and it was the first major Allied land victory in the war. However, in government and the church, there was still great nervousness at celebrating this victory with the ringing of church bells. In a memo to the Prime Minister of the 6th of November 1942, quote, "There is a good deal of misgiving amongst those who have heard of the bell ringing proposal. The Lord President, the Foreign Secretary and the Home Secretary all feel that this would be premature and that there is a risk that in the light of events it might appear ill-advised." The new Archbishop of Canterbury, William Temple, was not exactly keen. He wrote, I am anxious that the decision should be and known to be that of the government. I should myself prefer to wait until it can be said that North Africa is cleared of enemy troops, but this is plainly a point for the government to decide. On the 11th of November 1942, in the House of Commons, the Prime Minister spoke. Taken by itself, the Battle of Egypt must be regarded as an historic British victory. In order to celebrate it, directions are being given to ring the bells throughout the land next Sunday morning, and I should think that many will listen to their peals with thankful hearts. Some voices, very few, were raised against this. In the Commons, Aneurin Bevan, future architect of the NHS, asked, "Why are we ringing church bells next Sunday morning? It is a very silly thing to do. If you want to ring bells, ring them when final victory has been won." The majority of MPs who spoke disagreed, but the theme of caution was reflected outside Parliament. The Central Council president was almost apologetic with a preemptive strike. He wrote, "May I ask the public to be indulgent of their criticisms of any ringing which may be on Sunday morning. Ringing is an art which requires much practice, and for nearly 2.5 years there has been none. Many bands will be short-handed. Those who are left will do their best, but the quality of the ringing cannot be as good as we would wish." But after the ringing world described the public reaction as wonderful, heartening, and almost unbelievable. But some of the national press comments were less effusive. The Sunday Times sounded a note of warning, quote, "But there is always a danger in wartime that its meaning, the ringing of church bells, will be stretched too far. For that reason, we doubt the wisdom of ringing the bells today, and our view is shared by many." However, there were more optimistic reports as well, and quite soon that one day's ringing seemed to have somehow reignited a slumbering debate on the ban. Perhaps without being too melodramatic, the return of that sound had reminded the nation of what it had missed. Now, I'm getting a sneaking admiration for Archbishop William Temple, who seems to have had an astute political mind. Given his earlier lukewarm attitude to ringing on the 15th of November 1942, the day after he was writing to the Prime Minister, quote, "Now that the bells have been rung, I think to most people's great satisfaction and pleasure, I feel obliged to write at once to ask that the permission to ring them should at least be given for Christmas Day. There would, I think, be a great impropriety if the bells were rung for a military victory and not for Christmas. Might we not remove the ban and let the bells ring as normal to summon people to worship? I believe few things would have as stimulating an effect on the morale of the country. While I am writing, may I add that I have never myself been able to think of the bells as a good instrument to give warning of an attack." On the 23rd of November 1942, the Prime Minister himself came out in private, not in public, in favour of lifting of the ban. He wrote, "I am in favour of the Archbishop's request. I do not think the invasion danger warrants the maintenance of the ban." But then listen to a War Office note from General Sir Bernard Paget, Commander-in-Chief Home Forces, of the 29th of November 1942. He wrote, "I have not yet been informed by the Chiefs of Staff that the risk of invasion can be discounted. And even though the present possibilities appear remote, similarly, I have not been authorized to discount the possibility of airborne or seaborne raids. Church bells, apart from their invasion significance, are an essential and irreplaceable part of the machinery for countering enemy raids. It is impracticable to relax one part of the machinery without damaging the whole. Therefore, no relaxation should take place until the possibility of raids can be discounted for the rest of the war." I suspect the general was remembering the earlier difficulties across his command and did not want to do anything to unravel that. This exchange does show that the idea, which was prevalent sometimes at the time, that the military top brass would have no objection to the lifting of the ban and it was the politicians who were tied to it, was in fact the opposite of the truth. Indeed, the Prime Minister on the 7th of December 1942 was still fighting for the ringers, if only they knew it. He wrote, "The question of a practical alternative should not be dismissed. For instance, why could not we substitute for the church bells the sounding of the sirens for a quarter of an hour or more with quarter-minute intervals of silence? This would soon attract attention. Moreover, they are always instantly ready, whereas bell ringers have to be found and got to their steeples." However, in the end, the Prime Minister wrote to the Archbishop on the 7th of December 1942, "I regret that it cannot be considered possible. Sorry, I'll start again. I regret that it is not considered possible to accept the proposal that the ban should be completely removed. There are two main objections to such a course. The first is that no satisfactory alternative to bells as a warning signal has been found. The second, that such a step would, it is thought, be interpreted as a token that the government has discounted the danger of invasion or airborne attack. Very great importance is attached to this psychological factor, but no objection is seen to the bells being run on special occasions such as Christmas Day." Now, reading between the lines of the romantic imagery and patriotism of last Sunday, the first editorial in the Ringing World after the ringing on the 15th of November, you can detect a new optimism. "It was a great duty and great privilege which was laid upon us ringers last Sunday. The way in which last Sunday's ringing captured the imagination of the people was wonderful. The effect of the events of last Sunday on the exercise and its fortunes will not be small. We can now look to the future with redoubled confidence. The bells of England have not lost their hold on the affections and the sentiments of the people of England, and it does not look as if they ever will." It was always England, by the way, never Britain. A parliamentary reply to a question on the 1st of December 1942 indicated the first chink of light. Petty Officer Herbert asked the Secretary of State for War whether, in the light of recent events, will he reconsider the decision to use church bells as a military signal and adopt some arrangement which will not deprive the community of the bells. Sir John Gregg, this question is now being considered. Attention quickly moved to whether or not the bells could be rung for Christmas for the first time in 2 years, and there were a series of Commons questions. In the Ringing World editorial Christmas Bells, the editor speculated, "We find it difficult to believe that the military authorities now have any particular interest in the matter. Why then should not the ban be lifted, and whence comes the present opposition and indecision? About that we can only conjecture, but we believe ourselves that the deciding factor is the opinion of the Prime Minister." Slightly unfair, we might say today, given the accounts earlier of the secret conversations between the government and the military. In the end, however, the bells were permitted to ring for Christmas Day 1942, with reports of that ringing appearing in the Ringing World in January 1943. Now, in the early months of 1943, after the promise aroused by two brief liftings of the ban, the momentum for the lifting or relaxation of that ban seemed to slow down. In the letters column, a reader wrote, "The bells are now considered by the government to be a very good occasional tonic for the people. The bells are, like much else, controlled by the government, and occasionally we are treated to a ration of bell ringing." The Ringing World editorial on the 19th of February was downbeat. Since the temporary lifting at Christmas time of the ban on the use of church bells, the demands in Parliament and the press for its total abolition have abated. Why? The answer, we are convinced, is not because it is feared that the ringing of bells will cause a panic, but because it might lead careless and unthinking people to imagine unconsciously that there is less need now for effort, and chiefly perhaps because the Prime Minister attaches great value to the use of bells at times of victory. We shall not be surprised if the general restriction remains until the end of the war. But that March, the government did make a small amendment to the order. On the 11th of March, it was announced in the House of Commons, instructions have been issued for church bells to be used as a local alarm signal for raids or any other form of attack by enemy seaborne or airborne troops. The official papers show that this change was made, quote, to react to enemy commando raids, whether airborne or seaborne. But as far as bell ringers were concerned, the change had no practical effect. The ban remained. And for the editor of the Ringing World, in my words, well, that's that. The government has taken the opportunity to review the ban, and this is all they're prepared to do. In his own words, he said, ringers generally, and not only ringers, will have read with disappointment and regret that a new edition of the order has been issued. It puts to an end, definitely we fear, to all hopes that there might be some relaxation of the restriction, even if its total abolition was out of the question. We as ringers must submit. Did the editor not know what was to happen in 5 days' time in the House of Lords? A debate that was again to force the government to think again. On the 31st of March 1943, in a debate on the ringing of church bells in the House of Lords, the Archbishop of York, Cyril Garbett, moved to resolve, quote, that the ban on the ringing of church bells should be now lifted or modified. In his opening speech, he said, I want to make it quite clear at the very outset that I am not moving the motion on the grounds that all danger of invasion from sea or from the air has passed away. I move it because I wish to submit to your lordships that in a large number of cases, the ringing of the church bells will give no kind of useful warning. That in other cases, where the bells might be useful in that way, they could be rung without interfering with the ordinary ringing of the bells. And that therefore it is both unreasonable and unnecessary to silence bells which for centuries have been so closely associated with both the religion and the life of this country. Three other peers spoke in what was a brief debate, all in favour of the motion. No one spoke against, except Lord Croft, who replied to the debate on behalf of the government. He said, we share the desire of the most reverend prelate that the church bells should again come into general use. But so long as we are convinced that this is the only signal which can be regarded as a distinctive and definite warning, no alteration in the existing arrangements can be made. The motion was withdrawn, but the Archbishop did fire a warning shot at the government. He said, I hope in the near future it will be possible for the noble lord to make some further statement on the subject. If some satisfactory statement is not made in the near future, I shall be bound to bring this matter up again and take it to a division. The same day, our friend William Temple, the Archbishop of Canterbury, had written another cleverly politically drafted letter to the Prime Minister. He wrote, I'm writing to ask if permission may be given for the ringing of church bells on Easter Day. I think you will agree that the bells should be rung on Easter Day, if on any day at all. The Archbishop of York is raising the whole question about the use of church bells in the House of Lords. He consulted me about this, and I told him that I completely sympathise with him, but it was not at all at my suggestion that he took this step. I shall, of course, be very glad if the larger permission for which he is asking can be given, but I hope that this bigger question will not in any way be allowed to prejudice the request I have just made for Easter and Whitsuntide. Hedging his bets. The reaction to the Lords' debate was swift, and the momentum for change was clearly back. In the Daily Telegraph, the matter has not been given proper consideration, and the authorities should think again. It looks like a case of mere inertia. And Viscount Cranborne, leader of the House of Lords, wrote the day after the debate to a government colleague, quote, the cumulative effect of the debate on the House was very great, and the government would certainly have been heavily defeated if the Archbishop had taken his motion to a division. In conversation with the Prime Minister after the Cabinet this morning, I mentioned the debate as feeling in the House was obviously so strong. Now, even a strong government with wartime powers does not want to face a public defeat in Parliament, so the government now moved rapidly. At the War Cabinet on the 5th of April 1943, quote, the Secretary of State for War said the debate in the House of Lords had shown that there was strong feeling in favour of permission being given for the church bells to be rung. On the 12th of April 1943, the War Cabinet discussed the suggestion, quote, that the restriction on the ringing of church bells might now be entirely removed. The War Cabinet on the 16th of April 1943 considered a note from the Prime Minister. He wrote, I see no reason why, outside of specially regulated areas, the church bells should not ring on Sundays, Good Fridays, and other special days. The Chiefs of Staff have stated that there will be no invasion this year. There is, in my opinion, no danger that the announcement of the ringing of church bells will no longer play a part in our precautions against invasion, will discourage our home guard or induce a degree of slothful inertia among the regular forces. The Chiefs of Staff concur. On the 20th of April 1943, Hitler's birthday, the Prime Minister spoke in the House of Commons. The War Cabinet, after receiving the advice of the Chiefs of Staff, have reviewed this question in the light of changing circumstances. We have reached the conclusion that the existing orders on the subject can now be relaxed and that the church bells should be rung on Sundays and other special days in the ordinary manner to summon worshippers to church. The new arrangement will be brought into effect in time for the Easter celebrations this year. In a handwritten personal minute from the Prime Minister to Sir Edward Bridges, the Cabinet Secretary, headed Action this Day, the Prime Minister went a little further than he had in the House. He wrote, the ringing of the bells to summon worshippers, as described in my answer today, does not mean that the bells should be rung at odd times for weddings or funerals. This may come in a few months, but not yet. Although the ringing of the bells will no longer have the significance of invasion, this idea has been so seriously inculcated that unexpected ringing at unusual times might cause alarm. On the 22nd of April in the House, the Prime Minister confirmed that no other form of audible warning was needed. Replacement does not arise, he said. And he underlined that, quote, the significance of invasion no longer attaches to the ringing of bells. In the national press, in a leader in the Times, it was said, quote, the opinion was widely held that the silencing the bells would no longer be justified on military grounds. Whilst in the Daily Telegraph, gratitude to the Prime Minister and the War Cabinet is tempered with general wonder that the authorities have taken so long to make up their minds to restore the liberty of ringing. Naturally, our campaigning editor of the Ringing World welcomed the news. He wrote, the ban on ringing is lifted. To many people, not only to ringers, the news has come as a welcome surprise. For most of us perhaps had reconciled ourselves to the idea of having to endure it for so long as the war lasts. But as we know, politics rarely stands still, and soon a new question was being raised. On the 11th of May 1943, Mr. Dryburgh asked the Prime Minister whether he will supplement the recent decision to allow the ringing of church bells on Sundays by allowing them to be rung for practice and instruction once a week at a convenient time. In reply, again, Mr. Attlee, I cannot at present add anything to the reply given by my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister. The redoubtable editor of the Ringing World struck a balanced and measured approach. In his editorial, The Essential Thing, on the 14th of May 1943, he wrote, the partial lifting of the ban has failed to satisfy a considerable amount of public opinion, and it is not at all likely that efforts will be made to secure a complete removal of the restrictions. Anything like attempted agitation on our part would be a mistake. By the second half of May 1943, however, the government was preparing to move again. In a memorandum by the Home Secretary and Minister for Home Security to the War Cabinet dated the 21st of May 1943, Herbert Morrison wrote, it seems therefore that there should now have been, it seems therefore that there should by now have been sufficient time for people to readjust their reactions to the ringing of church bells. The retention of restrictions on the use of the bells, although they are no longer used as a raid warning, is looked upon in some quarters as unnecessary bureaucratic interference when no matter of public security is at stake, and is already giving rise to unfavourable comment. As there are grounds for thinking that the public are now fully aware that church bells are no longer to be used as a raid warning, I suggest that the restrictions on their ringing should be completely removed. On the 27th of May 1943, the Home Secretary told MPs, quote, "The government have now decided that the present restrictions on the use of church bells shall be removed. Church bells may be rung for any purpose at any time." On the 4th of June 1943, almost three years after the ban on ringing was imposed, the Ringing World editorial spoke for the wartime generation of ringers, and perhaps for ours in future months or years. Quote, "The ban on the ringing of church bells has gone at last. We have recovered our liberty of action, and it is for us to decide what use we shall try to make of it." Now, as I indicated at the beginning, this has been quite an amazing and hugely enjoyable historical journey for me, and has rekindled my interest in historical research and writing. I discovered that I knew nothing. I thought the ringing of the bells was a warning signal for any form of invasion. It wasn't. I thought it was a signal and alert to the public. It wasn't. I thought it was a nationwide alert. It wasn't. I thought it was a total ban for all 3 years. It wasn't. And I thought that ringing for Al Alamein was the only time the ban was lifted. It wasn't. And I simply had no comprehension of the sheer range of arguments made in relation to the ban. And what of the effectiveness of church bells as an invasion warning? Well, simply, we shall never know. In the desperate situation that the country found itself in the summer of 1940, I cannot really see that there was any alternative. It was the obvious choice. The bells were there. I suspect that if the invasion had come, that many of the finer arguments would have become irrelevant. With parachutists descending from the air, you don't worry about the key, you break the door in. You don't concern yourself with whether a ringer is at hand or not, you make a noise. And you don't worry about who you're warning. The signal may not be intended for the public, but they will hear it and they will react. I had also anticipated that my sympathies would lie with the ringers, and although I can relate to the anger and frustration expressed, I have to say that I found myself increasingly backing Mr. Churchill, at least when comparing the government view to the predominant view expressed in the Ringing World. Can we ringers be a little insular, parochial, and lacking in perspective then and now? Given that the nation was engaged in arguably the greatest struggle in its history and against its most vicious foe, some of the concerns expressed by some of the ringers can sometimes appear trivial. Having said that, I think a good cause with hindsight can be made that the ban could probably have been lifted earlier, or that arrangements could have been made to refine the ban to allow normal Sunday service ringing alongside a distinct ringing warning of invasion. But let's be fair to the government. In those 3 years, they did have a few other distractions. Once the debate in the House of Lords brought this matter up the political agenda, the government acted quickly, and I think in a measured way. And its calculation was more subtle and complex than perhaps contemporary commentary noted. My reading of the two-stage lifting of the ban in April and May 1943 is that the government did think that the danger of invasion had passed, but it was not going to say so, for fear of encouraging complacency. So it made no comment on the danger of invasion, and rather said that the bells or any other audible warning as an invasion signal was no longer needed. And once people had again become acclimatized to the sound of the bells and disassociated them from their recent military significance, it was safe to remove all the restrictions. There were some loose ends to my research. Yes, there were some loose ends to my research. Firstly, I didn't find any proof in what I saw that any of the protestations in the Ringing World had any impact on the government or the military. They may have done, I didn't know. I didn't find any evidence for it. And also, I was unable to access the Archbishop's papers in the Lambeth Palace Library, as that's closed during the pandemic. So I couldn't investigate the relationship between Archbishop's Temple and Garbett. I suspect there was something going on in that relationship. They were certainly not, pardon the pun, singing from the same hymn sheet. So, here we are in our own ongoing period of ringing restrictions. What parallels or differences are there with the wartime experience? There are obviously huge differences in the circumstances that have led to our state of affairs compared to 1940 to 1943. In our time, it's the COVID-19 pandemic that's the cause. Bombs are not dropping on us. We are on speaking terms with the Germans, and there are bananas in the shops. Then it was the need for a wartime invasion and for a wartime invasion signal. Now the restriction on bell ringing is part of a much wider lockdown on all aspects of our economy and society. Then it was a specific restriction on one activity. In our time, I think the general view amongst ringers is reluctant acceptance of the situation. Then for most of the 3 years, there was an underlying resentment and anger. Also, now the concerns of ringers, however hard the current Central Council works on our behalf, are not as high on the agenda of the church or the state as they were in the early 1940s. For the church, in our more secular multi-faith society today, the bells seem to be less important. And for the state, then the ringing of the bells was an issue of national security, so attracted the attention of the highest in the land, not today. So can we have a long view that highlights some of the similarities? To a more limited extent, I would say yes. Then and now, there was first a total ban, and then ringing was restricted. On both occasions, a dislocation in the normal pattern of life. Then and now, the Central Council acted as the bridge between us and the church and the state. And during both crises, there has been some confusion about what exactly the regulations are. The real striking similarities come, however, at the level of us as ringers as a community. It is here that the parallels hit you hard. Talk of supporting and communicating with each other, maintaining our societies and associations, keeping the ringing world itself going, fears for the future of ringing. These are all common to both periods of restrictions. Comparisons between then and now cannot, of course, yet be completed, as we do not yet know how or when the now will end, or the repercussions. But we can see that the wartime ban and the restrictions ended, and ringing, although undoubtedly set back, continued and thrived. In that respect, let us hope that history indeed repeats itself. The end.
Robert, thank you so much for that. That was an absolutely fascinating talk, and I particularly really enjoyed the sort of conclusions you were making at the end. Thank you. I think we have some time, hopefully, for some questions, if you're happy for that, Robert. And again, just to encourage people, to encourage people to either type things into the chat box or raise your hand or unmute yourself, and I will obviously try and keep an eye on that and invite people to speak. Robert, I had a question for you, and you sort of touched on it at the end, so you might say I've answered it, but what surprised me, both in your articles and in your talk, were, and again, you touched on it towards the end, but at the very top levels of government, Churchill himself, Herbert Morrison, the top levels of the military, there were parliamentary debates about ringing, and you just can't imagine that today. My first question is why? Again, I know you've touched on it, but why do you think it had such prominence in the 1940s, ringing, and yet I'd be surprised if the government today spent any time thinking about it, I'll say something unpopular in that you could probably sympathise with the government if they'd have said in the 1940s there are more important things to worry about.
Yeah, Arthur, it's a huge question, and I've since I wrote the articles, I've not stopped thinking about it. In doing these talks, you again think about the issues that you came across. It did strike me as I sat there looking at the agendas and the minutes of the War Cabinet, and you see on the agenda, I don't know, things like post-war dealings with Germany, division of Poland, relationships with Roosevelt, Italian campaign, church bells, and you think, what? Because when I first started looking at this, I thought, oh well, it'll be dealt with by a subcommittee of a subcommittee of a subcommittee, and the Undersecretary of State will, I didn't envisage that I knew the Prime Minister made certain statements, but I hadn't envisaged that it would be dealt with by the top men in the government at the time. And I think the issue is essentially that it was a matter, it was an invasion scare. It was the greatest danger that, as you know, that probably that England had been in, Britain had been in since Napoleonic times. It was a real threat of invasion, and it was a national security issue. That was the signal that the Germans were falling from the sky. So it was something that had to be dealt with by the highest in the land because it was a national security issue. But there is the whole thing running through it, which again is something that I hadn't anticipated, which I should have, though, because I used to work for the Church of England and I've studied the era, and that is the general position of the church and faith, Christian faith, in society at the time. Is a non-politically correct term to use it these days to call ourselves a Christian nation. But in the 1940s, although obviously church attendances were not at their Victorian height, Britain still called itself and saw itself as a Christian nation. And therefore, most of the debate that you got in the ringing world and the national press wasn't about what you might expect today, perhaps, especially in the ringing world, where ringers would be writing in saying, well, we can't ring peals, we can't do this, we can't do that. Most of the coverage was not about that at all. It was about the loss of ringing as a Christian witness and a call to worship. And because of the bigger influence of the church in the establishment, of course, the archbishops had, I'm sure they do now in a sense, but they had even more of a direct line to the prime minister. The correspondence between the prime minister and the archbishops, which I saw in the papers, they were obviously drafted by civil servants and looked at by undersecretaries, etc., etc., etc. But they, being government files, they have everything. They go from the first draft right to the original, right to the final document. And they went. There is annotations on the letters of the prime minister's in the prime minister's own handwriting. So if he was writing to the archbishop, or the archbishop had written to the government, and the government was writing back, it would come literally from the hand of the prime minister. Now, I don't think you get that today. So I think it's a combination of the fact that it's a security issue, national security issue, in a time of war when we were in the greatest peril that we'd ever been, plus the fact that you had a society which had a different view of the church than it has today. So I think those things mesh together to make it a much more different sort of scenario than we've got at the moment.
Oh, no, thank you for that. That's been quite something to have seen directly a letter that Churchill had annotated. That's quite something, I think.
Yes, he liked to doodle in the margins to the Lord President. He was saying, in modern parlance, he was telling him to pull his finger out, but that wasn't the words he used.
Simon Ridley asked, did the ban apply to both church and secular rings of bells?
I don't know. I didn't. But I imagine from the wording of the order back in 1940 that it just says, although it does say just church bells, doesn't it? Let's go back to it does say any church bell. So again, but what you have to remember, this was no time that you would go through the High Court, the courts, the magistrates, up for appeal. This was wartime. If you rang a church bell in wartime, there wouldn't be time for legal niceties. You would be stopped. And there are instances where very few and far between in terms of what was reported. There might have been more, but I did come across, and I did mention in my talk, I did come across a few instances where mainly the clergy, bless them, have been dragged up into the magistrates' court for when bells have been rung, because of course the order says it's not just the person at the end of the rope. It says it's sound a church bell or cause or permit. So being that the church then as now was under the the church bells were owned by the rector in his corporate capacity. There were instances of a few clergy being brought up with the magistrates. But to answer your question, haven't got any. I imagine even if it wasn't drafted that way, and because of course it was drafted in wartime, you didn't have time for a lot of niceties, it would have applied in practice to every church, every bell that could make a sound. Because if you're walking down the street and you heard a bell ringing, you wouldn't say, "Oh, well, that's coming from a secular building. I won't. The Germans aren't coming." If you heard a bell ringing, because that's one of the, one of the other arguments that ran around was, couldn't they modify it so you would have a specific bell ringing signal? So instead of having, so you could have rounds and call changes and method ringing that you normally have on a Sunday for Sunday service ringing, and then if the invasion came, you'd have a specific ringing sound different from that. So you'd either have one bell ringing, you'd have firing, you'd have something like that. But of course, on the government side, you can see that the distinct advantage is if you go from complete silence to any bell ringing, any sound of bell is ringing, that is a clear signal to whoever you're supposed to be signaling that something's up. Whereas if you have Sunday service ringing and then 10 minutes later the tower captain forgets and thinks, "Oh, I'll ring that bell down, I better go up and ring the bell down." 10 minutes later you hear a bell ringing, then there's a possibility of confusion. So the government clearly saw the advantage of having a complete shutdown. So when the bell was rung, the public or whoever was supposed to be told clearly knew what was going on.
Yeah, I suspect, like you, I think my thought is the same. I don't think there've been any patience around legal niceties of, well, it's a secular bell, it's not a church bell. I would imagine there'd be no.
No, well, it's the same with the argument about whether the Germans were targeting. They wouldn't come over. The Luftwaffe wouldn't come over and say, "Well, we're not going to bomb that one because it's a secular tower. We'll bomb that one because it's a Church of England tower." If that's another argument which came up, which I think was a red herring. That they were that it would made towers targets. As you would know, Arthur, there's lots of debates about bombing campaigns from both sides during the war. Our bombings of Germany and the other way around. But the technology of the time, it was carpet bombing. You just drop the bombs and you hope you hit your target or round about it. They didn't come over and drop the bombs and say, "Well, we're targeting this, this, and this." They might have said, "Oh, I'm targeting the docks." Or they would have carpet bombed Plymouth in order to hit the docks. They wouldn't have precision bombed the docks. So I don't think they could have precision bombed churches, even if they wanted to.
I'd try a different question for you, and it's about the ringing world. And so, you mentioned in your research you read obviously lots and lots of sort of past editions of the ringing world. Obviously, when there is restrictions to ringing, that hampers quite drastically what the ringing world can publish, and obviously the current situation with the ringing world, obviously it looks quite different to the ringing world does in normal times. I think many people these days will sort of praise the ringing world for the efforts it's put into obviously replacing the peel page and course peel pages and so on. I just wondered, what, other than arguments about restrictions of ringing, what else was the ringing world? What other articles, what other things were going on in the ringing world throughout this sort of 3-year period? Or was it all about war and restrictions?
No. Well, as you'd imagine, I skimmed through a lot of it because I was looking for particular things. But you won't be surprised that it was all the same rubbish that you get in the ringing world now. There were still people with the Germans breathing down our neck. There were still articles, long letters saying that this was a false appeal of Stedman triples. Well, the Germans aren't particularly worried about that, but you think there's more things going on. And there were compositions, there was, I think I showed in one of my slides, there was in terms of meetings, and obviously you couldn't have ringing, but the societies tried to keep ringing, the social side of it, going as much as they could. So they had their business meetings, especially at the it was less so towards the end of the war, but certainly at the beginning of the war, they tried to keep having their business meetings, and they had other events or entertainments to go on instead of the ringing. And there was handbell ringing, and there was all the sorts of normal things. Bless them, ringers died during the war, not fighting, but just because they getting on a bit, like they do now. So there were obituaries for famous ringers who died, or local people who died. So there was all the mixture. And in terms of the ringing world was free to publish within the restrictions of the time. Obviously, they couldn't publish anything that, even if they had it, that would be seen as something of advantage to the enemy. But they were quite free to to report as they did, like the national press did, on the debates in Parliament on the issue. And the one issue that I, going back over my articles and my looking at it again and thinking about it again, is the perennial issue. I think really is that I'm sure everybody who has anything to do with ringing will recognise what I'm about to say. But there is a danger of taking what's in the ringing world, either by the editor, bless him, I hope Will's not listening, by the editor, or by the people who write letters to the letters pages. They don't necessarily represent or a clear representation of the ringing community out there. So when you do read the ringing world, the predominant view is anger, frustration, lift this, it's not going to work, the government's not listening. There are more important things to do because I need to ring my peal of Stedman triples. Why can't I do it? Those are the sorts of things that you saw in the columns of the ringing world. I suspect that we don't have a Gallup poll, so we don't know. But I suspect that the ringers out there, that view did not necessarily represent what the view of the ringers out there was. So, when I was talking about my sympathies lying with the government, when you compare what the government said to the predominant view in the ringing world, my sympathies were more with the government. But I suspect that the great ringing public out there probably would have had more sympathy with what the government was saying than comes across in the ringing world.
Yeah, super. Thank you. There aren't many or any other questions in the chat box. I have one other, but I'll let you have a short breather, Robert, where I just talk about the next couple of weeks. And this is an opportunity if anyone does have any last questions to raise them now. But I'll just if I've got a captive audience, just talk about the next couple of weeks. So next week we have Lucy Gwynn joining us, and Lucy's a physiotherapist, and she's going to lead us in some physical exercises to help us sort of get those muscles back ready for a hopeful return to ringing in the not too distant future. The week after that, the 17th of March, we have David Bagley, who's joining us to talk about the history of ringing simulators. So again, two interesting talks. So if you're interested in coming to those and you're not currently signed up to our mailing list, I've just put a link in the chat box with all our future talks, actually, those two and the next sort of couple of months worth. If you email, there's an email address on that Google link. If you email me, I can add you to our Wednesday night training talk mailing list. You won't get lots of talks about other things. Don't worry. You'll just get the information about the Wednesday nights. Robert, you have lots of thanks coming into the chat box, so please make sure you have a read of those. But I do have one last question for you, and it's possibly a question more sort of with your ringing master hat on as well. But when John Anderson gave a talk a couple of months back to us, he talked about the impact of the Second World War. He joined the St. Martin's Band in Birmingham kind of in the early 1950s. And he said, in the short term, the Second World War had a big impact on Birmingham ringing and sort of St. Martin's and the band that he joined. But in the long term, the band rebuilt back up and recovered. And not that I expect you to have a crystal ball and predict the future for us, but I wondered what your thoughts were about, should we be optimistic about the future of ringing and actually in the long run actually things will recover, or are you more optimistic and actually we won't have a massive impact, COVID won't impact ringing, or actually do you think this will have a significant impact on ringing both in the short term and the long term?
I think ringers have a tendency to be pessimistic about things, overly pessimistic. I think. I think in the long view, I think the ringing will bounce back like it did after the war. There'll be bumps along the road, and it will be a definite setback. And a few people may decide they're not going to carry on. But the sweep of history is a horrible cliche, but you know what I mean. We do naturally as human beings, we hone in on the present, But as we move further and further away from the COVID situation and ringing comes back as part of our normal life, I think it had its we don't need to tell anybody here, but that there's a tendency to think, oh God, all these things are to do with COVID. There was lots and lots of issues that ringing had before that in our part of the world, as well as yours, I imagine, that were there before. A lot of them have been exaggerated and brought on a bit more quickly because of the pandemic. But most of the things that we're dealing with and the recovery and survival, I don't think they're necessarily new issues. They're issues that have just been brought to the fore and more significant because of the pandemic. And I think the ringing bug will carry on. And there will be things like virtual ringing, which has taken off in lots of, and that will be a new tool that will have come out of the pandemic that we hadn't thought about a year ago. And that, looking back, because I didn't include it in my talk, but in my articles, in one of my, I can't remember exactly the words now, but once the ban was lifted, the first ban was lifted, which was quite a brave thing to do. The editor of the Ringing World did write at the time about, when we look back, we might look at the wartime ringing ban and say it was not all bad, and there were advantages that came out of it. So I think we may take the same view in the long term. Who knows? But my gut feeling is it's a setback, but we'll get through it. And the problems that we had before, we've got them still. It's just been changed by the circumstances.
Super. And I'm an optimist at heart too, so I'm hopeful as well. So thank you so much, Robert, on behalf of all of us here tonight and on behalf of Martin's Guild.
Thank you.
I really appreciate the in-depth talk you've given and the reflections. You're going to really reflective end there in particular. Please have a quick look at the chat box. There's loads of thanks coming in throughout this evening. Put a couple of people had to leave early, but put their thanks in there. And with that, I will end the recording and give people a couple of seconds and then end the meeting. But thank you ever so much.